Supply disruption caused by the coronavirus pandemic has raised the cost of many things, mostly food items. And now the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has further raised the prices of most, if not all, commodities across the globe. As sanctions are being enforced against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, most merchandise and futures exchanges from Singapore to London are experiencing a flurry of movement as prices react to the conflict. At the present, gold, the safest store of value and most sought after bullion, sells for $2,000 an ounce. Palladium is now above $3,300 an ounce. Coffee, cocoa, corn, and wheat are also in short supply due to the combination of sanctions and further disruptions in supply. But with these new sky-high prices of commodities, is there any benefit for African producers of some of the commodities? Today, we're looking at the impact of the global surge in commodities on Africa. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-balogun. And joining me today is Gospel Obele, Chief Economist for Streetnomics Limited, and of course, a friend of the house. Gospel, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Tolu. Good morning.
Good morning to you. So let's take a look at another conflict several decades ago that did somehow lead to a windfall for African nations. That was the first Gulf War. And commodity pricing then reached record highs. Now, with this Russia-Ukraine conflict, many are saying it's a bit reminiscent of that war. What benefits did African nations receive then, unfortunately, from the circumstances that we might see being replayed in this circumstance now?
Well, technically, it's a bit reactive in the sense, when you look at it critically, it's a bit reactive because it's a lot of times we don't really get to learn from our past mistakes. It still shows the level of, in as much as, yes, this is globalization, economies are very connected, there should still be some level of not just self-reliance, positioning completely in such a way that whenever anything goes wrong, it doesn't disrupt, important aspects of your supply chain or your demand engagement as well. So what we've had in the Gulf War has been repeated now, where we see that the impact of these shocks would affect or impact the African economy much more deeply than it was then. And that was because we did not self-correct that trajectory, and it's happening again because we're still largely an import-dependent continent. We're still largely not so much of an innovative-driven continent, built on industrialization. We still depend on the West for a lot of things, and that would mean that any little shock to the global economy or the global space would affect economies, or rather African economies who are at the lower rung of the developmental ladder in a more severe way than it should. And that's because we're largely dependent. So it's a repeat of what has happened historically, but now with much more severe consequences.
Much more severe consequences. So it didn't really take long after Russia invaded Ukraine for the prices of commodities to rise. And we've seen oil right now heading towards, some are saying about $150 per barrel. And I'll ask you for your own projection in just a bit. But when it comes to this conflict in African commodity producers, what's going on right now? What are we seeing?
Yeah, so we're seeing a situation where, like you mentioned, first of all, the recovery from the pandemic, which has led to increased demand, has been met by supply shocks. And that's because of the geopolitics conversation we have right now with Russia and Ukraine. And because this is also a very developing story, in as much as a lot of countries are throwing down sanctions and all that, nations are also seeking to pedal a bit more softer or much more careful along the lines of allies, especially countries like Nigeria, who has strong stakeholders in the global oil and gas conversation as well. So that conversation is building, the story is developing, and we begin to see the impact permeate deeply. For African economies to a large extent, we are the first at many things, we talk about cocoa and many other things, but like I mentioned, the lack of competitive positioning over years has brought us to a point where, any geopolitical conversation or supply shock conversation globally can impact deeply on the last mile. And that's because we only produce in terms of raw materials. We do not transform to finished goods and competitive products. So that impacts us severely in terms of the economies of scale, balance of payments, balance of trade, and all the conversations we have, as much as inflationary risk as well. Yeah, so those are my initial thoughts on that, except we can turn it around internally.
Okay, so now looking at the crude oil prices, we're about 120, 121 right now. Projections have it to be 150 maybe before the end of this week into next week. We don't know how long this conflict will last. Pending that time, when do you think oil may hit 150, or if you don't think it will hit 150, what's your projections when it comes to global crude oil prices?
I mean, keeping everything constant. I mean, the way events are unfolding now, it's likely going to get to 150. I don't know if in the next 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks or a month, it's likely going to get to that level and slightly, probably even higher than that. So we won't be surprised to see the numbers moving in those directions. As far as everything right now is kept constant. Um, all of these conversations are also further influenced by the sanctions we've seen globally, and that's impacting heavily on the supply chain conversations and supply dynamics and production and distribution dynamics as well. I'm also noting the fact that African nations, particularly, have a huge demand for PMS, crude oil, finished goods in that space, as it were. So that demand side pressure would would impact heavily more on prices. Prices would likely skyrocket. So beyond just the geopolitics conversation, say for instance, you have fuel scarcity right now in Nigeria. That's already impacting on prices. Plus the fact that there are geopolitical conversations on supply, and there's also a subsidy conversation on the table. So prices would evolve or will rise, not just because of geopolitics, but because of other reactive-driven positioning for African nations who are heavy on global demand for these commodities. Not
And
just
I'm
oil,
happy.
by the way. Yeah.
And I'm happy you brought up Nigeria because I was going to ask the question now, but let me go ahead and bring it up now. We're seeing oil prices, and you're agreeing with the projection of about $150 per barrel. But the agreed, I guess, estimation of that for Nigeria is that the country is going to miss out on this windfall. One of the largest crude oil producers in the world, the largest on the continent, Nigeria is not likely going to benefit from this extra funding, the extra funds rather, that come in because of the high crude oil prices. Why is that? Why does it look like Nigeria is really not going to benefit? You've mentioned the issue of the subsidy. Of course, the fuel scarcity is there. And last week, the NNPC has said that they haven't been feeling the effects of the Russia-Ukraine situation just as of yet, but they are anticipating it. So why does it seem like Nigeria is going to miss out on the revenue windfall that would come from historically high levels right now of crude oil prices?
Yeah, so there are a lot of technicalities on this conversation. And that's because if you look at it very well, you earn money from doing something. When your cost of business or your cost of production, your cost of selling is very high, then it impacts heavily on your profit or your turnover or your positioning at the end of the day, or your solvency in a sense at the end of the day. So yes, we may earn in terms of as prices go up, but you notice that those prices that are going up globally are also reflective locally. So prices are as well going up locally because there's already a supply issue, number one. There's also the quality of fuel issue, fuel scarcity. There's also a subsidy conversation on the table. So there were already earlier crises when it comes to the crude oil conversation within the Nigerian context before the Russia and Ukraine or geopolitics conversation started. And that's going to impact heavily on the balancing out of that economics. When you look at it from revenue/costing perspective, and cost of importing fuel is also going to go high because those prices have gone high. So, and you now also talk about the fact that you need FX to run that conversation effectively or run that value chain effectively. And that would definitely impact on the revenue/quality of revenue we gained from that experience. Like I mentioned in several conversations with you on this fuel or PMS conversation, the idea would be to begin to think about self-reliance and sustainability across this point. I see no reason why little bit of shock to the global space hits heavily on the Nigerian economy, because we have everything it takes to absorb the shocks. Take, for instance, if we're producing these things locally, even if the price of oil goes high, we are at an advantage because we're producing at the quality locally and we're also exporting. by the way. So we'll be earning much more revenue received because we're exporting finished goods and we're producing en masse locally. But I mean, the tables are turned. We're exporting only raw materials and importing finished goods. So the price difference of exporting raw materials and importing finished goods with a looming FX crisis would impact heavily on the quality of revenue.
All right, so quickly before we go for a break, while it might seem Nigeria is missing out on the windfall from the high oil prices, there are some African countries that are positioned to make some extra money because of the high commodity prices. Who do you have your eyes on right now in terms of those who are in a best position to benefit from the situation happening right now?
I have eyes on Kenya because of tea exports and all that, flour exports, tea exports and all that, slightly on South Africa as well. And that's because they want more effective markets when you look at it from an access to market and global positioning for competitive exports. You know, and like I mentioned earlier on, this global commodities price hike will only favor those who already have the base, together. That means you are taking your raw materials in the agri space. You're plugging those raw materials in a very efficient industrialized space, all right? And then you're coming up with effective, competitive products, and you have very good access to market solutions as well. So once you engage from that angle, you're on the advantage part of this conversation. And Kenya looks very promising. South Africa also looks promising in that regard. Even some of the North African countries, Morocco and Co, look a bit promising. Egypt is a bit funny because you want to think of conversations around wheat subsidy and all of those bread subsidy and all that, which has been a looming conversation in Egypt for the past 6 to 7, 8 months now. And so those are my preliminary thoughts. But like I mentioned earlier, it's a developing story. As far as sanctions, the war continues, we'll see a lot of pressure on African economies. The only set of African economies that will be saved or will enjoy this benefit will be those who have a base for industrialization and competitive export positioning as well.
And I like you ended on that point because that's the point I want us to touch on when we are wrapping up the conversation is what are we learning about our vulnerabilities, our openness to being shocked, and even the advantages that African economies have when these sort of situations unfortunately come up. But Gospel, we'll get to that in just a moment. So when we come back, we'll continue the conversation on how the surge in global commodity prices is affecting the African continent. And of course, while there is business and trade involved, there's also politics. My guest has mentioned geopolitics, and we've heard from the United States Assistant Secretary of State for African Matters that African countries should choose sides. But when we choose sides, who's our best trading partner? The conversation continues after this. And still with me is Gospel Obele, the Chief Economist for Streetnomics Limited. We're looking at the impact of the global surge in commodities on Africa. Now let's go to the most industrialized nation on the continent, South Africa, which is set for a windfall as its mining companies are likely to earn more revenue as prices of commodities such as gold, copper, nickel, and more go up. And not being sure how long the conflict and the attendant high prices would last, the question now is, what impact could this extra revenue have on South Africa? So Gospel, let me bring you back into this conversation with the high prices that South Africa, I beg your pardon, could earn for gold, copper, and nickel. Could this help drive down South Africa's high inflation? Could it help sort of resolve its cash crunch? What impact could it have? Is it that impactful, or is it just some small extra money for the country to play with?
So yes, I would also think of it as a window, quite honestly. And it's a window because prices are up for some certain reasons. Geopolitics on the pipeline, the Russian-Ukrainian invasion is also on the conversation. So it's a window. It's not a sustainable opportunity. It's a window. And what happens during window opportunities is you want to tap as much as you can, save as much as you can, invest correctly, all right, and close your loose ends properly since you're on the winning side. So it's likely expected that South Africa will be earning a lot of good money, and the assumption, because at the end of the day, politics is also a strong political correctness. Rather, is also a strong, also influences the outcome of these investments. The assumption is that South Africa will use those monies correctly, for for efficient and effective economic management and to close the cash gaps and investment loopholes that currently has at the moment. So those are my initial assumptions or expectations. Rather, that would be seen largely from the political correctness lens than from an economic lens, in a sense. But it's a window opportunity. It won't last forever. By the time the Russian-Ukrainian war is, in quote unquote, over, if it will be anytime soon, prices or markets will also further redistribute and all that. So in the future, we'll know as this story develops.
So while we're talking a lot about the gain in oil, wheat, and other grains, there are other commodities at play. We've mentioned gold, copper, and nickel now. So what other commodities should we pay attention to? But also on the flip side of that, what commodities are losing, going down because of the conflict?
Yes, so headline cotton is going up. A lot of tea commodities are also going up. Agricultural commodities are also going up. Oil energy commodities are also going up. But then again, I would want us to think about the countries at the receiving end, either for positive or negative. I think this would bring some more economic divide or inequality divides across countries. Because some countries will suffer for it more than some others. Some countries will benefit more than some others, depending on your economies of scale, all right, on the energy plus non-energy commodities that are the fore of these gains, in a sense. So if you produce cotton now as a country, you do well in that space, you have efficient exports, competitive exports as well. You would definitely do way better than a country who only exports crude oil in terms of raw materials and tries to import finished products. So it's the dynamics that works across which commodities. There are also some other countries that, in terms of global positioning now, some commodities are on the advantageous end, some other commodities are not on the advantageous end. So the conversation will now be how will those countries play accordingly, across commodities that are on the advantageous ends than those who are on the losing end. So it's a power of play dynamics in terms of commodity dynamics, how you push your buttons, and pull off gains correctly for your economic growth and development within a pandemic year. Do not forget, IMF have also said that global growth is likely to shrink by 0.5%. But the countries that will trigger growth either ways will be countries who can engage the dynamics across these commodities exchange in terms of gains and losses for their own internal advantage. So it's not so much about the market, it's so much more around how the players engage the market across their competitive advantage or comparative advantage, as the case may be.
Okay, so you've mentioned geopolitics, I think maybe 2 or 3 times as a word in this conversation, and we've seen some of that also come into play. So the United States Assistant Secretary of State for African Matters, Molly Fee, has called on African nations to unitedly condemn Russia for its actions. Today, Russian exports to Africa are worth about $14 billion, and imports of African products are worth about $5 billion. And we've also seen Russia over the past few years trying to deepen its ties, and Russia does also have historic ties, being involved in many of the nation's liberation struggles. So it's not a new entrant into the political game and the business strategy and things happening here on the continent. When it comes to business and trade, what kind of position do you think African countries are in with this Russia-Ukraine conflict right now?
I think African countries are, how do I put it, because of our long history of action and inaction that has brought us to that receiving end of things right now. I mean, like you mentioned, commodities, geopolitics, and all this comment on how it is impacting Africa right now. Because of that positioning we are at a very, very sensitive positioning in a sense. And really, to be honest with you, I mean, just think about somebody who needs to do something and get something out, but he or she doesn't have an option. So calling on African countries to sort of take sides may be a little bit of risk because, I mean, the West wants to hear where you are, and I don't think there are much conversations around trying to resolve the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as they are around taking positions. So I in my head, I don't really think the best option would be to take position for African countries because we are so much risk and we don't even have what it takes to deal with the consequences of taking a position should in case, the conversation the table turns later on, should in case Russia finds the middle ground with Ukraine, it may just be that African countries may not be on the, may not be better off for taking a position, because top of mind, everybody knows the position he or she should take in this conversation. But I don't mean to say this, but in my head, I'll think of African nations should try and be correct along the lines of interest than along the lines of taking positions. So at the end of the day, that's what it's going to come down to. If the war is going to end, the war is going to end on the basis of interest, not on the basis of positioning. And countries who have taken position already have what it takes in terms of foreign relations and all those intricacies to come down on the basis of interest at the end of the day. So I would think of African countries to go in the line of interest and diplomacy or correctness than taking sides now, because it's going to be a long shot tomorrow, and we don't want to be on the bad side of this conversation.
All right, so very quickly before we wrap up, this conflict has, again, as you said earlier, reinforced just how global business has become. Aftershocks effects are being felt everywhere for people who are not involved and who actually want no involvement in this Russia-Ukraine conflict. And you mentioned the fact that it seemed African countries did not learn lessons from the Gulf War, from the first and the second, in terms of how to protect themselves and also how to take advantage. So when it comes to our vulnerabilities, the things where we have competitive advantages, and even how to protect our economies from some of these external shocks, what lessons do you think are there for African economies right now as this Russia-Ukraine crisis continues to develop and move? We don't know what could happen. Talks have begun, and things could be different in the next 2 to 3 hours or in the next 2 to 3 days.
Yes, so first and foremost, it's really, really painful and pathetic that African nations do not really learn from the mistakes of the past. We don't know why, but we don't learn, and it comes back to hurt us in future events, even deeper, structurally, economically, and otherwise. And it puts us in a very, very strategic risk positioning where we can't take sides or take decisions. You can only take sides or make decisions when you call the shots, at a level. So for me, I think the first thing is for us to sit back and understand that we are much more vulnerable than we think as a nation, as a continent, and as a people. And that's because we've not been able to look internally enough to develop our own strength and competitive positioning should the case push come to shove, which we already have right now, the situation. All right. So, and when push come to shove, it's nations who have the competitive positioning that would gain the advantage the most. All right. So we want to see this as this Russia-Ukraine conversation and the geopolitics conversation as a global disruption, just the way coronavirus disrupted the global economy. All right. Countries who are already preparing, knowingly or unknowingly, will be at the advantage end. So we need to do more around all of the self-reliant conversations. We have a very strong agricultural raw material base as a continent, in many cases and across many commodities, the first in the world in terms of volume and all that. But we've not been able to transform in terms of competitiveness, value processing, and positioning. Right? Those are three different things that we need to critically look at. And when we begin to look at that, then we need to think about the institutional effectiveness across this thing, so that when you have leaders who are inclusive in ideology and in nature, they can help you, put all of that positioning into context, such that you're gaining from that than losing from that. Because if you have the wrong institutional positioning at the end of the day, you have leaders who will help you export your products and services or build efficient exports, but the money comes back to a critical few. All right, so we need to be able to ensure that all of the pipelines across competitive positioning are effectively closed. Then educate your people, position your people to be at the benefiting end of this conversation. We've seen the stories of Nigerians who are studying in Ukraine. If our educational system were effective, Nigerians have no business studying in Ukraine and won't be at such a loss. So it still boils down heavily on self-reliance and ensuring that the construct within the African space is properly in view for global competitiveness and positioning. Yeah.
All right, Gospel Obele, thank you so much. I know we can't have a crystal ball and see how this is going to play out, but in the meantime, we'll continue to have these conversations and touch base. Thank you so much, Gospel.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
All right. And the words at the end, self-reliance for the African continent and lessons learned, and of course, making sure that we're able to institute more value in the commodities and the resources that come from here on the continent. You're watching Business Edge. Up next is NC4 to watch. And these are a few stories we are keeping our eyes on right now. Nickel prices have soared past an unprecedented $100,000 a ton on the London Metal Exchange amid a huge short squeeze that's embroiled in a major state-owned Chinese bank and encouraged rule changes from one of the world's top commodity exchanges. The material used in stainless steel and electric vehicle batteries surged as much as 111% on Tuesday after rallying as much as 90% the day before. Nickel rose 106% to $99,000 a ton as of 2:23 p.m. Shanghai time. Oil prices keep rising higher as the U.S. moved a step closer to imposing a ban on Russian crude imports following its invasion of Ukraine. WTI rose above $121 a barrel after settling on Monday at the highest level since 2008. The fallout from the war has upended markets, driving everything from wheat to nickel and gasoline higher and leaving the world bracing for an inflationary shock. Oil has rallied more than 30% since the invasion, and traders and banks are betting prices will keep climbing. Total Energies SE has instructed traders not to buy any Russian oil as pressure grows to isolate the country from world energy markets. And finally, South Africa's transport minister's failure to appoint two crucial air licensing councils allegedly to benefit South African Airways is now preventing the same takeoff of the airline. Now the airline is seeking regulatory approval for the sale of 51% of its shares to the Takatso Consortium. And that's Business Edge for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. Follow us on social media, download our mobile app, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and take us with you wherever you go. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-balogun.